Welcome to the Neurokrish Immersion. This is the episode on the inspired brain, and this is part 2 of the podcast masterclass. And before you listen to this one, you'll probably do well to listen to part 1. Now, what did we address in part 1? We addressed the Indic masters of aesthetics and what their aesthetic experience taught us. We talked about Tyagaraja, Tansen, M.S. Subbulakshmi, we talked about Laurie Baker, Rukmani Arundale, we talked about K. Balachandra, the filmmaker, and we talked about how aesthetic experience has got deep brain and mind underpinnings in that podcast. Now, in the next episode, we are going to talk about how brain activation leads to meaningful human experience. Let's begin with Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine. Centuries ago, he said to us, "From the brain and from the brain only arise our pleasures, joys, laughter and jests, as well as our sorrows, pains, grief and tears." It's a remarkable statement because it gathers in one full sweep the range of human feeling, joy and grief, laughter and tears, pleasure and pain, not in the heart, as one would have imagined in his time, centuries ago, not in some invisible vapor, which people were still talking about at that time, not in a disembodied spirit, but in the brain. Very interestingly, even today, we do not live as though this were obvious. We still seem to negate the role of the brain in all these human emotions, and that should be our first takeaway as we start this podcast. I began my exploration of neuroaesthetics in 2009 with an article that I wrote for the Hindu magazine called Inspirational Genius. It's behind a paywall, but if you do have access, you'll probably enjoy reading that article. When we speak of love, we still touch the chest, and when we speak of thought, we touch the head. But when we speak of inspiration, we often gesture vaguely, upward, outward, inward, as though it came from somewhere that cannot be named. This is not a contradiction, it's a clue. The human being does not experience life as anatomy, we experience life as meaning. In that Inspirational Genius article, I began by asking, does the soul, as it is manifested in literature, religion, and music, have a cerebral basis? And I deliberately used the word soul in a provocative manner. I'll go on to explain this better as we go through this broadcast. Now, neuroaesthetics has a central challenge. When you do these aesthetic tasks or you experience various aesthetic experiences, your brain shows activation in various brain areas: the orbitofrontal cortex, the insula, the anterior cingulate, the hippocampus, the motor cortex. But it does not show us what it means to be moved by a raga at dawn, or to stand before a chola bronze and feel stillness and motion when you see that Nataraja bronze, or indeed to hear a poem and suddenly remember someone long gone, or indeed see a tragic film and weep, not because we were harmed, but because something in us was touched. Aesthetics is not simply the study of beauty in the brain. It is a study of how sensation becomes feeling, how feeling becomes meaning, how meaning becomes memory, and how memory becomes part of the self. Now let me repeat that for you so you sit with it. Neuroaesthetics is not simply the study of beauty in the brain. It is the study of how sensation becomes feeling, how feeling becomes meaning, how meaning becomes memory, and how memory becomes part of the self. Sit with that. Now, this is one reason why we must resist the temptation to reduce neuroaesthetics to a map of brain activations. That is just a beginning, not the end. Aesthetic experience is neural, but it's also embodied, contextual, cultural, symbolic, autobiographical, and often spiritual for most of us. And this is something that would be good for us to internalize. One important way, therefore, to understand the biology of neuroaesthetics and indeed to consider it in this wholesomeness is to take a systems approach. And there is in contemporary rehabilitation, aesthetic experience seems to arise through an interaction of sensory motor, emotional valuation, and meaning knowledge systems. So you have sensory motor systems, you have emotion valuation systems, and meaning knowledge systems. The interaction between these is what gives us the sense of aesthetic experience. That triad is important because it immediately moves us beyond the shallow question, where is beauty in the brain? Beauty is not in one place. It emerges from an encounter. Object, perceiver, memory, body, culture, expectation, and value all coming together. And I have put for you in the visual guide to the podcast, which comes on YouTube, a graphic which comes from a paper, A New Priority for Neuroaesthetic Research, the Reifying View. And I'd like you to go and look at that graphic because it tells you about these different systems and how they interact. So let's begin there. Not with beauty as decoration, not with art as leisure, but with aesthetics as a fundamental mode through which the brain organizes experience. The brain does not merely receive the world. The first scientific shift we must make is that the brain is not therefore a camera. It doesn't just passively receive a world that's already complete. It predicts, selects, compares, completes, amplifies, suppresses, values, and interprets the world that is presented to it. And even ordinary perception is not simple reception for your brain. It is active construction. And let me just give you one very simple example to think about. How often do you find yourself completing a piece of music as you're listening to it? Because you've listened to it before and your brain knows what to anticipate. That is how your brain deals with aesthetics. So when we look at a painting, we do not merely register color and contour. We search for coherence. We infer depth. We detect tension. We ask silently, why is this line here? Why does this face hold me? Why does this image disturb me? Why does this form feel graceful, heavy, broken, or serene? And I have a very good personal experience of this. I have this wonderful painting done by an artist, and this was painted to music. It was an oil on canvas that he painted when we were playing music. And because we played Spanish music, it's quite interesting. The painting is almost Picasso-like, but it has three faces looking away from each other. And I very often ask people who come into my room, when I had it hanging in my room, what do you think of this painting? And everyone had a different interpretation. Many talked about two spouses looking away from each other because they were angry, and the third person being the significant other related to one of the spouses, and so on. So your brain makes meaning of what you are encountering. It just does not simply receive it. And I think that's very, very important. When we hear music, for example, we don't merely detect frequency. We anticipate, as I said, the next note. We feel the delayed resolution. We sense the return to tonic, the bending of pitch, the pause before release. Music exists because the brain predicts time. And when we watch dance, similarly, we do not merely see bodies moving. We internally simulate movement. We feel weight, balance, acceleration, poise, collapse. A dancer's raised arm is not a visual fact alone. It's a motor possibility inside us. And I'm sure that you'll have experience of unconsciously moving when you are watching other people move. For example, you go to a party and there are people dancing and you're simply sitting and watching it. Very often you're moving with them. And that is how your brain anticipates many, many aesthetic experiences. And hence that aesthetic triad I talked about is useful. The sensory motor system receives and simulates. The emotion valuation system feels and assigns salience. Why is this important to me? And the meaning knowledge system links the experience to memory, culture, identity, and interpretation. And I have put on the visual guide a very interesting rehabilitation review called Neuroaesthetics: Exploring the Role of Aesthetic Experience in Neurorehabilitation, which frames aesthetic experience as involving perceptual, cognitive, emotional, and evaluative engagement, not merely liking. And this means that when we speak of aesthetics, we are not speaking of something superficial, we are speaking of whole brain participation. A great deal of early neuroaesthetics was understandably fascinated by pleasure. What happens when someone sees something beautiful? What happens when music gives someone chills? Which regions respond to preference, liking, reward, and valuation? Now, all these studies were important and they show to us, for example, the involvement of various parts of our brain, the prefrontal and the orbitofrontal regions, the reward systems, the insula, the cingulate cortex, the striatum, the sensory cortices, and the motor networks. The rehabilitation paper notes, however, that aesthetic stimuli activate pleasure and motivation circuits and may even promote plasticity. Neuroplasticity is such an important part of us getting better from any form of brain injury. It also highlights link between prefrontal activation, frontostriatal modulation, attentional control, the default mode network, the orbitofrontal cortex responses to beauty, and the reward-supported consolidation of neural circuits. So there's plenty going on, and if you're interested in any one of these brain regions, all you have to do obviously is to look them up online and you will get a picture which tells you about them. But what I've done is put out a graphic which talks about the brain network of aesthetic experience. Again, you'll see this on the visual guide, and all the different areas that I have mentioned are represented on the graphic for your convenience. But pleasure cannot explain art. I mean, if aesthetics were just merely pleasure, then tragedy would make no sense to us at all. Why do we therefore return to sad music? Why do we watch films that break our hearts? Why does the Karuna Rasa elevate us? Why does a melancholic raga console rather than merely depress? Why does a poem of grief make us feel more alive? The answer is that the brain does not seek pleasure alone. It seeks meaningful experience. And aesthetic sadness is not ordinary sadness. Ordinary sadness may trap the self. You kind of wallow in it. Aesthetic sadness gives sorrow a form. It creates distance without detachment, emotion without immediate threat, and immersion without destruction. I find this so helpful, I'm going to repeat it for you to think about it. Aesthetic sadness is not ordinary sadness. And while ordinary sadness may trap the self, aesthetic sadness gives sorrow a form. It creates distance without detachment, emotion without immediate threat, immersion without destruction. A tragic film allows us to feel grief within a frame. A poem allows pain to become language. A raga allows longing to unfold in time. A painting allows anguish to be seen, held, and contemplated. And in his book, Why Humans Like to Cry, Professor Michael Trimble explains this in great detail with multiple examples. But here's a little synthesis. The prefrontal cortex, when you engage in tragic aesthetics, the prefrontal cortex knows that it is not immediate danger. There is that detachment that you're able to view it with. The limbic system says, however, that this matters. And your autonomic nervous system, which is so deeply connected with your emotional brain, responds. Your default mode network links feelings to autobiographical memory, which is when you often start thinking about your own tragic experiences when you're watching tragedy in any form unfold in front of you. Very often when you watch a film, for example. Reward pathways may still engage, not because the experience is happy, but because meaning itself is rewarding. And this is where Trimble's Why Humans Like to Cry at Tragedy becomes meaningful. It corrects a narrow pleasure model. Aesthetic experience is not the pursuit of pleasantness, it is the safe encounter with emotional truth. So what's the insight that we can take away from this? We do not go to art to avoid pain. We go to art to feel pain without being destroyed by it. That single insight becomes clinically important later because many people we see with various forms of brain trauma or injury are not suffering from lack of instruction. They are suffering from emotions that are either overwhelming, flattened, fragmented, or inaccessible. Aesthetic form can make emotion available again. And here I also draw you to the mental health concerns like serious depression or recovery from bipolar disorder, where once again feeling can be impacted and people find it very hard to feel. The inability to experience emotion called alexithymia is such an important part of being depressed. And aesthetic form helps us make emotion available again to such people. But there is a reductionist trap. And here Ian Verstegen's critique is especially valuable. Again, the reference is there in the visual guide. He argues that much neuroaesthetics has been disappointing because it often explains too little of what makes art profound. To say that a painting activates reward circuitry may add descriptive texture, but it does not explain aesthetic value, symbolism, or why an artwork matters. He explicitly critiques the field for being reductive and for failing to explain what is most interesting about art. And his is therefore not just it's not an anti-science argument, it's a better science argument. Because we are at risk when we go down this pathway of correlating experience with which part of the brain lights up, it will just become the new phrenology of beauty. And, just to understand this for the listener, I should take you back, 1.5 centuries before, where phrenology was the speciality or subject where brain morphometry, the size of your skull, was used to describe factors about you, your temperament, your intelligence, and so on. And it was later proven to be so wrong. Now, we may be just repeating that today by saying, oh, this part of your brain lights up when you watch a painting and it makes you sad. That is just like another form of phrenology, is what he's arguing. So when we say that music activates our dopaminergic systems, we have not really explained Tyagaraja. When we say that Nataraja, the cosmic dance, activates visual and motor systems, we have not really explained the cosmic dance itself. When we say a sad film activates limbic networks, we have not explained why a viewer emerges purified, reflective, or morally awakened by watching that film. The problem is not that these findings are false. The problem is that these on their own are incomplete. Art is therefore not simply a stimulus response. It requires a gap between world and mind. It requires representation. It requires symbolic distance. And Verstegen calls out forms of neuroaesthetics that make the organism fit too perfectly into its environment, leaving no space for reflective stance. If perception were only coupling, resonance, and adaptation, art would collapse into practical response, is the argument. But art is not practical response. It's reflection, transformation, and commentary. And here I also bring you a K. Balachandar insight. And I invite you to go back and watch any one of his movies where he uses a mirror. For example, say Aval Oru Thodar Kadai. A mirror is not just a mirror, it's fragmentation. He uses window grills. They are not just visual geometry. It is an indicator of domestic captivity. He uses swings to indicate emotions. It's not just instability, recurrence, or emotional oscillation. A clock that he shows you is not simply time. It is the burden of duty, the exhaustion of the working woman, the relentless rhythm of family expectation. The brain perceives these objects, yes, but the mind reads them, culture deepens them, memory personalizes them, emotion charges them, and meaning transforms them. And that really is neuroaesthetics at its best. And, as a fan of K. Balachandra, I can say if you go back and watch several of his movies, there are many things left unsaid, yet they deeply move you because he has inserted there something that gives you a message without the message actually being said to you. So I'd invite you, especially if you understand Tamil, to go back and watch this. And we have a very nice graphic in the visual guide of Balachandra's cinema and how objects like mirrors, window grills, swings, and the clock bring about meaning and give us neuroaesthetic meaning. Now, there is the idea of reification, which helps us go deeper. Reification in aesthetics is the process by which the brain transforms abstract, incomplete, or symbolic inputs into a coherent, meaningful, felt reality. So, you watch, for example, a painting and you feel moved by the painting. It's not that the painting on its own did that. It is a message. It is a symbolic reality that the painting brought to you, which brings about that emotion. And your brain does not simply copy the world. As I said, it anticipates the world. It completes it. It organizes it. It turns fragments into wholes. It creates perceptual realities that are not identical to the physical stimulus. This is familiar in what we call Gestalt psychology. A few lines become a triangle. A distorted form becomes expressive. A slumped figure in a rigid cityscape becomes not just a person sitting, but human defeat under urban hardness. Verstegen's paper develops precisely this point. Art formalizes the brain's capacity to abstract symbolism from cognition, and perception itself contains meaning because it's already abstracting, analogizing, and metaphorical. This is profound. It means that art is not a luxury that's added after perception. There is therefore that whole area of aesthetic transformation that we have to consider. Art reveals to us something already present in our perception. We are always making worlds. We are always completing fragments. We are always assigning salience. We are always reading posture, line, rhythm, tone, silence, pause, balance, asymmetry. What aesthetic experience intensifies is this normal process. It slows perception down enough for us to notice meaning being born. And that's really the beauty of the abstract, whether it's in art, whether it's in music, whether it's in film, whether it's in architecture. This is how the abstract moves us. That's why a Chola Nataraja is not only bronze, it's movement held in stillness. This is why Ravi Varma's Lakshmi is not only pigment, she is recognizable divinity brought into domestic intimacy. And if you go back to the first edition of this podcast in part 1, we've talked about how Ravi Varma's lithographs came into every home in South India, many homes in South India, and brought through them to each person a vision of divinity and how it should be imagined. This is why Laurie Baker's exposed brick is not only material economy, it's ethical architecture. Less concealment, less excess, more honesty, more climate sensitivity, more human scale. And this is why Rabindranath Tagore's Mind Without Fear is not only poetry. It's a cognitive, emotional, moral and civilizational state. So when he says, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world is broken into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where the stream of reason does not meander its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where tireless striving reaches out to perfection, into such a heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. Now that is awakening your cognitive, emotional, moral and civilizational state. And remember, this was written when your country did not have freedom. So what's the insight? The brain makes the percept, the mind makes the meaning, culture gives it depth, the self receives it as experience. I've also put out a very interesting reference in the visual guide, which is an article in Scientific American on neuroaesthetics and how it reveals the arts help with dementia and trauma. This is an article by Susan Magsamen. It's available, it's free to web. It gives us a modern public health bridge. It places neuroaesthetics at the intersection of arts, health, medicine, science and technology, defining it as a study of how arts and aesthetic experiences measurably change body, brain and behavior, and how this knowledge can advance health, well-being, learning and flourishing. What is striking in the article is the return to the origins. She brings back Edward O. Wilson's image of early humans gathered around a fire and points out that this is more than charming anthropology. It's a model of shared aesthetic regulation. Around the fire, human beings told stories, sang songs, danced, made myths, draw images, and bonded. Firelight was perhaps our first theatre, first classroom, first temple, and first clinic. And perhaps this is where music originated as well. The arts did not emerge after survival was complete. They were part of human survival. And human beings are therefore wired for art. They bonded groups, transmitted memory, regulated fear, encoded values, preserved identity, transformed danger into story, and made the unknown bearable, all through their engagement with art. And this is why it's wrong to place aesthetics outside medicine. Long before clinics, human beings used rhythm, chant, image, ritual, dance, story, color, symbol, and shared attention to regulate their nervous systems. And this is what modern neuroaesthetics is rediscovering in laboratory language, what cultures have always known. So let me repeat for you, humans are wired for art. And one of the most clinically powerful sections in the Scientific American article concerns trauma. It describes how traumatic experience can impair our capacity to speak about what happened, referring to the shutdown of Broca's area during a traumatic experience, making verbal narration difficult or impossible. Art interventions can help restore the ability to make sense of traumatic memory and share it with less emotional dysregulation. This is crucial. Trauma is often not first stored as a story. It is stored as sensation, image, startle, smell, bodily tension, avoidance, nightmare, flashback, shame, freeze. And if you've been through a traumatic experience, like an accident, for example, you will understand what I'm trying to say. To ask the traumatized person to narrate through early may be to ask the wrong system to do the first work. And in such circumstances, art can enter before language does. Aesthetic experience, therefore, can become part of clinical situations and be a clinical state. Mask making, for example, as described in Creative Forces, is an extraordinary example. The mask is not the trauma, it is not the person, it is an intermediate form. It permits projection, distance, symbolization, and control. The person can place something unbearable outside the self and look at it. Then another person can look with them, and then language may return. It's not just decoration, it's a neuropsychiatric method. Aesthetic form allows externalization of emotions. Externalization allows distance. Distance allows regulation. Regulation allows us to build narratives. Narratives allow integration. And this really is the therapy pathway that we need to espouse. I go back to the rehabilitation review, and again I have the reference in the visual guide, which makes a very important claim. Aesthetic experience need not be treated merely as a motivational extra. It may function as a cognitive amplifier, increasing attentional engagement and improving perceptual and learning processes. It's low cost, adaptable, and can precede or accompany rehabilitation without requiring complex technology. And this really gives us a clinical opening, because in rehabilitation we often we start too late. We begin with the task, ask people to walk, speak, remember, attend, inhibit, plan, repeat, but the brain may not really be ready for all that. The anxious brain cannot learn well. The depressed brain does not initiate. The traumatized brain avoids. The Parkinsonian brain freezes. The aphasic brain struggles to access language. The demented brain loses autobiographical continuity. And aesthetic engagement, therefore, can precede therapy as state preparation. And I have a visual graphic that shows you how music can entrain, rhythm can organize, mandala drawing can structure, dance can mobilize, art can regulate, narratives can contain, reminiscence, so important in dementia treatment, can restore identity, and literature can reframe. All of this can help in sensory engagement, cognitive integration, emotional regulation, meaning and identity, and bring the therapy closer to the person receiving it. And I think that is the important and beauty of neuroaesthetics. So what then is the inspired brain? It's not merely the creative brain, not merely the rewarded brain, not merely the emotional brain. It is the brain in a state of meaningful integration. Sensory systems are awake, motor systems are engaged, emotion is available, reward is active, attention is held, memory is stirred, the self is implicated, and meaning emerges. Your inspired brain needs all that. I go back to that article in the Hindu magazine when I talked about the concept of Trinity talking. The brain, mind, and what we may cautiously call soul. And here I talk about aesthetic experience being a representation of the soul. They are not three separate substances. They are three registers of one human event. At the brain level, networks synchronize. At the mind level, experience becomes coherent. And at the soul level, if we use the word functionally, the person feels inspired, energized, moved, and enlarged. This is not mystification. It is a language for human wholeness. The inspired brain is a brain in which cognition, emotion, body, memory, and meaning are not fighting one another. They are aligned. And that really is your Trinity talking. And when such alignment occurs, human beings create, heal, decide, forgive, remember, move, sing, and sometimes transcend. And that's why aesthetics belongs in neuroscience, and that's why it also belongs in clinical care. And that is where part 3 of the Inspired Brain podcast will be taking you in the future. And that's the next move. The therapy window it's not a detour from science, it is natural clinical fulfillment. Let me leave you with this thought. The inspired brain is not merely a brain that enjoys beauty. It's a brain made receptive to feeling, to memory, to movement, to meaning, and ultimately to change. And as we come to the end of that podcast on the Inspired Brain, part 2, we also leave you with a wonderful graphic on the neuroscience of aesthetic experience, which again you can watch on the visual guide, and I hope we'll make some of this downloadable for you as well. If you like what we do here at the Neurokrish Emotion, please subscribe and share. We are on Apple, YouTube, and Spotify. Thank you so much.